Welcome to the third video in our series on implicit bias in artificial intelligence. In this video, we will examine the distinction of implicit bias as it is generally understood from a philosophical standpoint and how it manifests in real-world human interactions. From there, we will take a look at what kind of strategies have been developed to mitigate implicit bias within the psychological domain. But before we proceed, please allow me to make a simple request. If you find value in our work, please consider subscribing to our channel so that you'll be the first to know when we release a new video. Thank you. Your support is greatly appreciated.
What do we mean when we speak about bias? What is bias, and what exactly are the distinguishing factors that make a bias implicit? To gain a better understanding of the term, let's look at where the word originates from. The concept bias stems etymologically from Occitano-Romance languages, translated in Old French as biais, used to denote when something went sideways, askance, or against the grain. This eventually evolved, signifying a slant, a slope, or an oblique. The term was integrated into English through the game of bowls, describing balls crafted with more weight on one side, as the concept acquired its pejorative connotation. The usage of the term bias later broadened to a one-sided inclination of the mind and unjust predisposition or prejudice. A cognitive bias represents a systematic deviation from a true or fair representation, often influenced by preconceived notions, prejudices, or favoritism, which can occur in various fields including statistics, research, or human decision-making. Cognitive bias impairs the ability to make rational judgments. It's a form of systematic error that can affect perception, societal attitudes, and even scientific research. A cognitive bias is a mental shortcut, a heuristic, that absolves the agent from extensive critical examination and renders the bias de facto incomplete and epistemically problematic. Psychology, however, recognizes numerous types of cognitive biases, most of which can be either implicit or explicit to the agent. However, it's important to note that the explicit-implicit distinction is mainly used to address the influence of implicit bias on social issues, and not so much on individually held biases. An explicit bias represents a prejudice the agent is consciously aware of. Consequently, an implicit bias represents a prejudice that the agent is not consciously aware of. The agent is usually capable of explicitly justifying an explicit bias, which makes this bias observable and revisable by the agent. Because of its implicit nature, an implicit bias can be challenging for the agent to identify and to control. On the other hand, even if an explicit bias can be rationally motivated, it may still be underpinned by implicit intuitions or unconscious inclinations. This underscores the multifaceted nature of cognitive biases in general, suggesting that any bias likely comprises elements of both conscious rationalization and unconscious predispositions. In other words, while the implicit-explicit dichotomy provides a useful framework, the degree of implicitness of a cognitive bias is likely distributed across a spectrum on a continuum. The main characteristic of an implicit bias is the divergence between the agent's conduct and its professed beliefs. In Gabrielle Johnson's paper titled The Psychology of Bias, From Data to Theory, the author presents two positions that may explain this divergence. The first position advocates for the so-called dual construct model, which suggests that two distinct cognitive constructs are operating on both sides of the divergence. The second position supports the so-called rationality of bias model, which posits that two identical rational processes are at work on either side of the divergence. The latter model suggests that an implicit bias isn't entirely resistant to counter-evidence, unlike the former, which implies that only an explicit bias is susceptible to cognitive revision when confronted with counter-evidence. Furthermore, it must be noted that even explicitly held biases can turn out to be immune to counter-evidence, as agents can willfully abstain from seriously considering alternative scenarios. Being right and congruent with formally professed beliefs can be a completely independent psychological force capable of sustaining a bias. In the next video, we will list 3 commonly used strategies to leverage the identification and revision of implicit bias in natural intelligence.
We've reached the conclusion of another episode in our series on implicit bias and its manifestation in artificial intelligence. We encourage you to share your insights and questions in the comments below. If you found value in this episode, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. Your feedback and subscription are valuable endorsements for us. We look forward to hearing from you.